Imagine the thumping sound of rotor blades cutting through the humid air of the Mekong Delta. Dozens of helicopters sweep low over the rice paddies, kicking up mud and water as South Vietnamese troops prepare to land. American advisors watch with confidence. This will be quick, they think. Just another sweep against a small band of Viet Cong hiding in a village called Ap Bac. But within seconds, the sky erupts. Bullets tear into the choppers, fire rakes across the paddies, and soldiers are cut down before they even reach cover. Helicopters crash into burning wrecks. What was supposed to be an easy victory turns into a humiliating disaster. And in that single day, the world learned a lesson that would haunt America's war in Vietnam. Firepower, technology, and numbers meant nothing if your enemy refused to break. Before we dive into this forgotten but crucial battle, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Over 90% of viewers never hit that button, but your support helps us bring you more untold stories from the Vietnam War. Now, let's go back to January 2nd, 1963, and uncover what really happened at the Battle of Ap Bac. By the early 1960s, the Vietnam War was still officially called a conflict. America had not yet committed hundreds of thousands of combat troops. Instead, Washington's strategy was to strengthen South Vietnam's army, the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, with training, equipment, and American advisors on the ground. On paper, the ARVN looked strong. They had modern weapons, armored personnel carriers, artillery, and, most importantly, U.S. helicopter support, something the Viet Cong could never match. Many American officials believed the war could be won by turning the ARVN into a smaller version of the U.S. Army, relying on firepower and mobility. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. The ARVN officer corps was plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and political loyalty to President Ngo Dinh Diem, rather than to battlefield effectiveness. Many soldiers were reluctant to take risks, often leaving the fighting to U.S. advisors and helicopter crews. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the Viet Cong were growing stronger. They were lightly equipped, but they knew the terrain, they had the support of local villagers, and they used classic guerrilla tactics. Hit, disappear, and strike again. For years, they had avoided fighting large battles, preferring ambushes and assassinations. But by 1962, things were changing. In the Mekong Delta, just south of Saigon, Viet Cong units were becoming more organized, more disciplined, and better armed. They dug trenches, set up hidden bunkers, and learned how to fight not just as guerrillas, but as small units capable of facing conventional forces. The Mekong Delta itself was one of the most dangerous battlegrounds in Vietnam. A maze of rivers, canals, rice paddies, and dense tree lines, it gave the Viet Cong perfect cover. Helicopters could land troops quickly, but once those troops were on the ground, they were often surrounded by unseen enemies. By late 1962, U.S. intelligence believed they had a chance to strike a decisive blow. Reports indicated that a sizable Viet Cong unit, maybe a few dozen, maybe 100, had gathered near a small village called Ap Bac. The stage was set. What was supposed to be an easy victory would soon turn into one of the most embarrassing defeats of the war's early years. In late December 1962, reports began to reach South Vietnamese and American headquarters. A sizable Viet Cong force was on the move in Dinh Thuong province, deep in the Mekong Delta. The intelligence was unusually precise. Scouts and informants claimed that around 120 Viet Cong fighters had gathered near a village called Ap Bac, about 40 miles southwest of Saigon. For U.S. advisors, this was exactly the kind of opportunity they were waiting for. The Viet Cong normally fought in hit-and-run ambushes, vanishing before government troops could respond. But here, in the flat rice paddies around Ap Bac, they seemed to be staying put. That meant they could finally be trapped. The operation was planned quickly and with confidence. The ARVN would deploy over 2,000 troops to surround and destroy the enemy. Armored personnel carriers would punch through from one direction. Infantry would be lifted in by helicopters, landing close to the village. Artillery would be on standby, and American advisors would oversee the fight at every stage. On paper, it was overwhelming. The ARVN had superior numbers, firepower, mobility, and air support. Against them stood a ragtag group of guerrillas, armed with old rifles, mortars, and a few heavy machine guns. American advisors believed this would be the moment to showcase how U.S. strategy could crush the insurgency. Newspapers could headline it as a demonstration of ARVN's strength, proving that with American help, South Vietnam was winning. But what no one realized was that the Viet Cong knew they were being hunted. Instead of fleeing, they dug in and prepared a trap of their own. The mission to wipe out the Viet Cong at Ap Bac was set for the morning of January 2nd, 1963. On paper, it was one of the most carefully coordinated ARVN operations to date. U.S. advisors believed this was their chance to prove that South Vietnam's army could fight and win a major engagement. The plan was straightforward: use overwhelming force to surround and crush the enemy. From the south, 2 battalions of ARVN infantry would advance on foot, pushing toward the village. From the north, a column of M113 armored personnel carriers would drive across the rice paddies, their heavy machine guns ready to cut down any resistance. Overhead, American helicopters would ferry in additional infantry to seal off escape routes. And if anything went wrong, artillery batteries stood ready to rain shells onto Viet Cong positions. In total, the ARVN force numbered over 2,000 men, backed by armor, artillery, and helicopters. A modern army, supplied and trained by the United States. Facing them were no more than 350 Viet Cong fighters, possibly fewer. They carried aging Soviet and Chinese rifles, a handful of mortars, and several .30 and .50 caliber heavy machine guns. To American eyes, they looked like a small, ragtag force. But the Viet Cong had one advantage the ARVN often lacked: discipline and preparation. Instead of retreating, they dug deep trenches along the tree lines and fortified hidden positions in the dikes that bordered the rice paddies. Their machine guns were carefully placed to cover the open landing zones where helicopters would be forced to drop troops. And every fighter knew the plan: hold the ground no matter what. For the Viet Cong, this wasn't just survival. It was a chance to prove they could face a modern army head-on. As dawn approached on January 2nd, the ARVN troops, their American advisors, and the helicopter crews prepared for what they thought would be a swift and decisive battle. What they didn't know was that Ap Bac was about to explode into one of the most humiliating defeats of the war's early years. In most battles up to this point, the Viet Cong avoided direct confrontation. They struck quickly, ambushed patrols, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. But at Ap Bac, things were different. The local Viet Cong commander knew the ARVN, and their American advisors were coming. Spies and informants in the villages had already reported unusual troop movements, the rumble of armored vehicles, and the buzzing of helicopters. By the time the ARVN began to assemble, the Viet Cong had already made their decision. They would not run. Instead, they chose to turn Ap Bac into a killing ground. They dug trenches and spider holes along the tree lines and irrigation dikes that bordered the rice paddies. Their positions were invisible from the air, camouflaged with brush, rice stalks, and mud. Heavy machine guns were placed to cover the open fields where helicopters would be forced to land. Mortar teams were concealed in hidden pits, ready to fire the moment ARVN troops began moving. Each fighter was assigned a clear role. Riflemen were spread out in small cells, tasked with pinning down advancing troops. Machine gunners would focus on the helicopters. Mortar crews would disrupt ARVN reinforcements. The order was simple: hold your fire until the enemy is close. Then make every bullet count. For the Viet Cong, this wasn't just about defending a village. It was about proving a point. For years, they had been underestimated, dismissed as guerrillas who could only fight in shadows. But now they wanted to show that even against modern helicopters, armor, and artillery, they could stand and fight like an army. As dawn broke on January 2nd, 1963, the Viet Cong were already in their bunkers, rifles clutched tightly, sweat dripping down their faces in the humid Mekong heat. They listened as the distant thumping of rotor blades grew louder. The Americans thought they were flying into an easy victory. The Viet Cong were waiting to prove them wrong. The morning of January 2nd, 1963 was hot and heavy with humidity. Over the flat expanse of rice paddies, the thunder of 13 U.S. helicopters filled the air as they skimmed just above the tree lines. Inside, South Vietnamese infantry gripped their rifles nervously, eyes scanning the fields below. American advisors leaned forward, watching for the landing zone. From above, it all looked calm. Just endless paddies of green rice stalks, broken only by narrow dikes and scattered huts. The pilots steadied their helicopters, preparing to set down the first wave of troops. Then as the choppers descended, the quiet shattered. From hidden trenches and camouflaged tree lines, the Viet Cong opened fire with a ferocity no one expected. Heavy machine guns ripped into the formation, bullets slashing through rotor blades and cockpits. And in seconds, helicopters began spiraling into the mud, their engines burning, rotors snapping. Troops who managed to leap from the doors were cut down as they hit the paddies. Others were trapped inside wrecked aircraft, smoke and flames pouring into the air. The landing zone had become a death trap. American advisors on the ground watched in shock. They had expected a quick landing and a rapid push toward the village. Instead, they were seeing helicopter after helicopter smash from the sky. Still, the order was clear. Keep landing troops. More helicopters swooped in, only to face the same storm of fire. Pilots tried to maneuver, banking hard, but the Viet Cong gunners were disciplined and deadly accurate. Within minutes, 5 helicopters lay wrecked in the paddies, their crews dead or wounded. More than a dozen others were riddled with holes, limping back to base. It was one of the most devastating single blows to U.S. helicopter forces in the war up to that point. And on the ground, the ARVN infantry, who made it out of the landings, were pinned down, refusing to advance under the withering fire. American advisors shouted, begged, and even tried to lead charges themselves. But the soldiers dug into the mud, terrified to move forward. The carefully crafted battle plan was already falling apart. What was supposed to be a showcase of modern military power was unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. And the battle had only just begun. By midday, the battlefield around Ap Bac had descended into chaos. Smoke rose from the wreckage of downed helicopters, their twisted frames burning in the paddies. The cries of the wounded carried across the fields. But despite overwhelming numbers, the ARVN advance stalled almost immediately. Pinned down in the open, South Vietnamese troops refused to move forward. The incoming fire from Viet Cong bunkers was too fierce, and many soldiers simply pressed their faces into the mud, unwilling to lift their heads. American advisors tried everything, waving, shouting, even standing up under fire to set an example. But it made little difference. The armored personnel carriers that were supposed to roll in from the north only made things worse. The M100's 13S, designed for roads and dry ground, struggled across the sodden rice paddies. Their treads bogged down in the mud, and when they did move, they became massive, slow-moving targets. Viet Cong gunners poured fire into them, disabling several and forcing the others to pull back. For hours, the battle locked into a deadly stalemate. The ARVN infantry refused to advance. The Viet Cong stayed hidden in their trenches, trading fire only when necessary. American helicopter crews attempted desperate rescue missions, flying low to pull out the wounded, but every run risked another aircraft being shot down. Each attempt to press forward ended in disaster. Artillery barrages thundered onto the tree lines, sending plumes of smoke and dirt into the air. But when the haze cleared, the Viet Cong were still there, waiting. They had dug too deep, too well, and they would not be dislodged. The longer the battle dragged on, the worse the frustration grew among American advisors. They knew they had the numbers and the firepower to win, but their allies simply would not fight. One U.S. officer later recalled it as one of the most maddening experiences of his career. We could see the enemy, we could point to them, but the men would not move. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the reality became impossible to ignore. Instead of crushing the Viet Cong, the ARVN had been pinned down by a force 1/10 their size, and still had not taken the village. The humiliating stalemate was a preview of what was to come in Vietnam. Overwhelming strength on paper, but paralysis on the battlefield. As dusk fell over the Mekong Delta, the fields around Ap Bac were littered with the wreckage of helicopters, the burned-out shells of armored carriers, and the bodies of soldiers who had never made it past the paddies. For nearly an entire day, the ARVN had been frozen in place, trading shots from a distance but never breaking through. American advisors were furious. They had begged their counterparts to push harder, to close in on the trenches where the Viet Cong were firing from. But by evening, it was clear the South Vietnamese troops had no intention of risking further losses. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, had held their ground far longer than anyone expected. As night began to fall, they carried out the last part of their plan. Moving silently through the tree lines and hidden dikes, they slipped away under the cover of darkness. By the time ARVN forces cautiously advanced the next morning, the enemy was gone. The official ARVN reports later described the battle as a victory. After all, they claimed the Viet Cong had abandoned the battlefield. But the reality was undeniable. A small force of guerrillas had stood toe-to-toe with a modern army, inflicted heavy losses, and then vanished almost at will. For the South Vietnamese, the result was humiliation. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call. And for the Viet Cong, it was a triumph, proof that they could hold their ground against overwhelming firepower. The Battle of Ap Bac was over, but the consequences were just beginning. When the gunfire finally faded and the last Viet Cong fighters melted into the night, the battlefield told the real story. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had suffered heavily. More than 80 ARVN soldiers were dead, and over 100 were wounded. Several armored personnel carriers had been disabled, and large numbers of rifles and equipment were abandoned in the mud. The United States paid a steep price as well. 5 helicopters were destroyed, and at least 3 American advisors were killed, with more wounded. For a war that Washington still insisted was being fought primarily by South Vietnamese troops, the loss of U.S. lives and aircraft was a grim warning of what lay ahead. And the Viet Cong? Their casualties were shockingly light. Estimates vary, but most reports put the number of dead between 18 and 30 fighters, barely a fraction compared to ARVN losses. Not only had they held their ground against an army nearly 10 times their size, but they had also inflicted heavy casualties before slipping away almost intact. The disparity stunned everyone who saw it. A supposedly modern, well-equipped army with overwhelming air power had been bloodied and humiliated by a small force of guerrillas hiding in trenches. American advisors were furious, not just at the losses, but at what they had witnessed. The ARVN had refused to advance, refused to close with the enemy, and in many cases had ignored direct pleas to fight. The frustration was summed up by one U.S. officer. We had everything we needed to win, except the will of the men who were supposed to fight. When news of the battle reached Saigon and Washington, official statements tried to spin it as a success. But the truth leaked out quickly. Reporters like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who had been covering the war closely, reported the reality. Ap Bac was not a victory, it was a disaster. Those reports would begin to shift public opinion in America, planting the first seeds of doubt about whether the war in Vietnam could ever be won. On the surface, the Battle of Ap Bac was just a single engagement, a village skirmish in a war that would stretch on for more than a decade. But its significance went far beyond the rice paddies of Dinh Thuong province. For the South Vietnamese army, Ap Bac was a harsh exposure of their weaknesses. Despite outnumbering the enemy nearly 10-1 and holding every technological advantage, they had failed to press the attack. Poor leadership, hesitation under fire, and an unwillingness to take risks had turned what should have been an easy victory into a humiliating defeat. American advisors walked away from the battlefield furious and disillusioned. For the United States, Ap Bac was a warning. Washington had been pouring weapons, money, and training into South Vietnam, convinced that modern firepower and mobility, especially helicopters, could defeat a guerrilla force. But Ap Bac proved otherwise. Technology alone could not overcome poor morale, flawed leadership, and an enemy with iron determination. For the Viet Cong, the battle was a milestone. Until then, they had mostly relied on ambushes and guerrilla tactics, avoiding direct confrontations. At Ap Bac, they had stood their ground against modern forces and won. The psychological boost was enormous. Word spread quickly through Viet Cong networks that if they were disciplined, well-prepared, and determined, they could face overwhelming odds and come out on top. And for the American public, Ap Bac became one of the first cracks in the illusion of progress. Thanks to courageous reporters like David Halberstam, who refused to parrot official government claims, the truth reached newspapers back home. South Vietnam's army was faltering, and U.S. advisors were frustrated. For many Americans, Ap Bac was the first glimpse that the war in Vietnam might not go as planned. In short, Ap Bac mattered because it was a preview of the entire war to come. ARVN forces struggling to fight effectively. U.S. advisors caught between frustration and denial. The Viet Cong proving they could go toe-to-toe with a modern army. And the media beginning to challenge the rosy official reports. What happened in a single village on January 2nd, 1963, foreshadowed the long, bloody struggle that would follow. The legacy of Ap Bac stretched far beyond its muddy rice paddies. For the Viet Cong, the battle became a story of pride and resilience. They had faced the modern weapons of a superpower and held their ground. It was proof that their strategy could work, that determination, discipline, and local knowledge could outweigh helicopters, armor, and artillery. That belief would fuel them through years of grinding conflict. For the ARVN, Ap Bac left scars. Their failures were impossible to ignore. American advisors began to question whether South Vietnam's army could ever stand on its own. The same issues seen at Ap Bac, reluctance to fight aggressively, poor leadership, and dependence on U.S. firepower, would plague the ARVN throughout the war. For the United States, Ap Bac was more than just a setback. It was an omen. Advisors and journalists recognized it as a symbol of deeper problems. But instead of pulling back, Washington doubled down. More helicopters, more money, and eventually more troops were sent. What had happened at Ap Bac was supposed to be a wake-up call. Instead, it became a warning ignored. And for history, the battle became a lens through which the entire Vietnam War could be understood. The imbalance between power on paper and performance in the field, the gulf between official reports and battlefield reality, and the determination of an underestimated enemy. All of it was visible that day in the paddies of Ap Bac. On the morning of January 2nd, 1963, the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies thought they were flying into an easy victory. By nightfall, they had learned a brutal truth. In Vietnam, numbers, weapons, and technology did not guarantee success. The Battle of Ap Bac was small compared to the massive battles that would follow, but its lessons echoed through the entire war. It showed that the Viet Cong could stand and fight. It revealed the flaws of the ARVN and the limits of U.S. strategy. And it foreshadowed the long, costly struggle that would eventually drag America into one of its most divisive wars. In the end, Ap Bac was not about the size of armies or the strength of machines. It was about willpower, determination, and leadership. And on that day, it was the Viet Cong who had all three. A forgotten village in the Mekong Delta had just shown the world what the Vietnam War was really going to be.